there is a clay column in Oxford that most people will never see. It sits in the Ashmolean Museum, catalogued, translated, occasionally referenced in footnotes. It is not displayed with particular drama. It does not have its own wing. If you walked past it, you might not stop. The label describes it as a historical administrative text from ancient Mesopotamia, which is accurate in the same way that describing a detonator as a small metal object is accurate. Technically true. Deeply insufficient. The object is the Weld-Blundell Prism, a four-sided column of baked clay inscribed in Sumerian cuneiform, acquired by the Ashmolean in 1923. It contains one of the most significant texts to survive from the ancient world, the Sumerian King List, a document that records the names of kings, the cities they ruled, and the lengths of their reigns. Administrative in form, political in purpose. The ancient equivalent of an official state record, and 8 of the kings it lists ruled before a flood. That would be interesting enough on its own. But what the prism says about those 8 kings is what the field has spent a century carefully explaining away. One king ruled for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. A king named Enmenlu-Ana of the city Bad-tibira is listed at 43,200 years. The numbers run into the tens of thousands across every pre-flood entry, and they do not apologize for themselves. They are simply recorded in the same matter-of-fact register used to list every other king in the document. These numbers appear inside a king list, not a hymn, not a creation myth, not a priestly incantation. A king list, the administrative genre Sumerians used to establish dynastic legitimacy, record political succession, and anchor taxation authority across generations. This is the ancient world's legal record, and it assigns reign lengths that exceed the total span of recorded human civilization. The standard explanation is clean and quick. The numbers are symbolic. The pre-flood section is mythological padding, borrowed from religious tradition to give the later historical kings a divine origin. The flood is a literary device, possibly a distant echo of local Mesopotamian river flooding, later absorbed into the tradition that produced the biblical Noah narrative. The pre-flood kings are not real. The numbers are not literal. The document is political theater. That explanation has been repeated for over 100 years. It appears in undergraduate textbooks, museum placards, and introductory lectures on ancient Near Eastern civilization. It sounds reasonable. It is also built on an assumption so significant that acknowledging it openly would change the shape of the entire argument. The assumption runs like this: because the reign lengths are impossible, the kings must be fictional. Because the kings are fictional, the cities can be treated as literary invention. Because the cities are invention, the flood becomes literary device. And because the flood is literary device, the document as a whole becomes manageable. Each step of that reasoning depends on the step before it. Pull the first brick, and the wall begins to move. Here is the first brick. The cities named in the pre-flood section of the Sumerian King List are not literary inventions. They are real. They have been excavated. They have been stratified, dated, and published in peer-reviewed archaeological literature for decades. Eridu, listed first as the city where kingship descended from heaven before the flood, has been excavated and carbon dated to approximately 5,400 BCE, making it one of the oldest confirmed urban sites on Earth. Bad-tibira is archaeologically attested. Sippar is extensively documented. Shuruppak, the last pre-flood city listed, has been excavated, and what the archaeologists found there is not nothing. At Shuruppak, there is a flood layer, not a story about a flood. A physical stratum of water-laid silt, dated by excavators to the late 3rd millennium BCE, separating earlier habitation levels from later ones. The layer is distinct and measurable. It represents a real interruption in human settlement at that site. The Earth itself holds the record that the standard explanation wants to assign to ancient imagination. Now step back for a moment. The King List names cities that exist. Among those cities is one where a flood layer physically separates two distinct periods of human habitation. And the document records this transition, the flood, not in the language of myth or epic poetry, but in the flat, procedural voice of administrative notation. The University of Oxford's electronic text, corpus of Sumerian literature, renders the transition this way. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Read that carefully. It is not invocation. It is not prophecy. It is the same dry, sequential language used to record every other transition in the document. From one reign to the next, from one city to the next, from one dynasty to the next. The flood is not treated as a divine narrative. It is treated as an administrative fact, noted the way a ledger notes a gap in production. Then the record continues. This is the first fracture. The official story requires the flood to be literary and the cities to be symbolic. But the cities are real, and the flood layer is physically present in the soil of one of them. The document is not inventing its geography. It is not inventing the disruption. It is recording a transition between two known periods of Mesopotamian settlement, centered on an event the Earth has confirmed. Which means the question is no longer whether the document contains real information. The question becomes, how much? Now look at the numbers themselves, because the field's treatment of them deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. The pre-flood rain lengths are recorded in the Sumerian sexagesimal system, base 60, the numerical framework the Sumerians used for mathematics, astronomy, and timekeeping. We inherited it. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. The system is still present in every clock on the planet. It is not primitive. It is one of the most elegant numerical frameworks in human history, and it has been studied by mathematicians and astronomers for generations. The pre-flood rain lengths are not random within that system. Scholars who have examined the arithmetic have noted that the numbers follow internal patterns. Some are multiples of 60 squared, the Sumerian unit called the sar, which equals 3,600. Researchers examining the arithmetic structure of the pre-flood section have argued that certain rain lengths correspond to multiples of the astronomical units used in Mesopotamian planetary observation, a correspondence that has been noted but not formally integrated into mainstream Assyriological interpretation. Several of the pre-flood rain lengths align with structures that appear in Babylonian sky texts, tied to planetary period relations that scribes tracked across generations. The total of all pre-flood rains, accumulated across the 8 kings, amounts to a figure so precisely structured within the sexagesimal framework that calling it decorative invention requires more faith than the alternative. What this raises is a possibility the standard explanation has no clean answer for. What if the rain lengths are not measuring the lifespans of individual rulers? What if they are measuring something else? Astronomical periods, calendrical cycles, cosmological intervals. And the named kings are labels assigned to those intervals in a political register? What if this document is a calendar wearing the format of a king list? That interpretation does not require fantasy. It requires taking seriously the possibility that a civilization sophisticated enough to give us the base 60 number system might have embedded astronomical records inside their administrative texts, the same way they embedded celestial observation inside their religious architecture, their agricultural calendars, and their legal frameworks. The field's response to this line of inquiry has been consistent. Acknowledge the internal logic of the numbers, then reassign them to sacred numerology. The arithmetic is noted. The astronomical argument is absorbed into the category of religious symbolism, and the document remains contained. But the Sumerian King List does not exist in isolation. The Eridu Genesis, another Sumerian tablet, discovered separately, names the same pre-flood cities and describes the same flood event from a different register entirely. The Epic of Ziusudra, an independent text in yet another genre, names a flood survivor whose story maps precisely onto the later Babylonian Atrahasis epic and, eventually, the biblical Noah narrative. These are not copies of each other. They were produced at different times in different genres: administrative record, cosmological hymn, heroic epic, by different scribal traditions, all converging on the same structural framework: the pre-flood cities, the flood itself, the interruption of organized civilization, and the resumption afterward. The standard explanation for this convergence is mythological borrowing. One culture absorbs the stories of another. Archetypes migrate. Human psychology produces similar imagery across unconnected traditions. This is a defensible position when applied to narrative themes in isolation. It becomes considerably more strained when the overlapping documents are corroborated by a physical silt layer in an excavated city. What the mainstream calls mythological cross-pollination may instead be something more precise: multiple communities, working in different formats, encoding the same real event in whatever form their tradition made legible. Not borrowing. Translating. This is where the question stops being about one clay prism and starts being about a much larger problem. Because if multiple independent Mesopotamian texts are recording the same catastrophic event, and if the cities they name are archaeologically confirmed, and if the administrative document listing the pre-flood kings contains numbers with internally consistent astronomical structure that has never been formally disproven, then the standard explanation does not require one interpretive leap. It requires several, quietly stacked, each one depending on the one below. That stack is invisible as long as nobody examines it. The examination has been discouraged not by censorship, but by something more durable: categorization. Consider how the same logic was applied to a different anomaly. Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey was built approximately 11,600 years ago. It required organized labor, coordinated architectural planning, and symbolic abstraction, all of it preceding agriculture by several centuries. A civilization sophisticated enough to carve and erect precisely oriented stone pillars was doing so before humanity was supposed to have developed the social organization to attempt it. The initial institutional response was specific. The site was classified as a ritual or ceremonial center, not evidence of complex society, a ritual site. The categorization acknowledged the structure while neutralizing its implications. A ritual center does not require rethinking the developmental timeline. It can be absorbed. The challenge can be filed. The Sumerian King List has been handled the same way. The pre-flood section contains real cities, a physically corroborated flood, and numbers with internal astronomical logic. The response: classify it as mythology. The classification does not refute the evidence. It simply places the evidence in a category where it cannot threaten the larger framework. This is not conspiracy in the theatrical sense. It does not require backroom coordination or deliberate suppression. It requires only that a field build its consensus early, organize its categories carefully, and train its practitioners to apply those categories consistently. When the framework is foundational, evidence that destabilizes it gets relabeled. The label becomes the answer. The question disappears. The prism has been sitting in Oxford since 1923. The pre-flood rain lengths are still there, exactly as inscribed. The cities are still confirmed. The flood layer at Shuruppak is still in the earth. And the case that the numbers encode something real, something calculated, something deliberately structured by people who understood precisely what they were recording, has never been formally refuted. It has only been filed, which means the question is not whether the official explanation is convenient. The question is whether it is actually supported by the evidence, or whether it is simply the explanation that survived because it was the one the field was built to need. That question has a longer answer, and it begins not with the clay, but with the people who decided what the clay was allowed to mean. The field that controls interpretation of Sumerian texts is called Assyriology. It was founded in the mid-19th century, developed almost entirely by British and German scholars, and built during a period when the excavation of Mesopotamia was not an act of neutral scholarship. It was an act of imperial access. The sites were under British and French archaeological control. The tablets were transported to European institutions. The categories used to organize them, myth, legend, religious narrative, administrative text, were developed by men working inside universities that understood the Bible as the foundational document of Western civilization, not as one ancient text among many. This matters because categories are not neutral. They determine what a document is allowed to mean. When a Sumerian tablet described gods walking among humans, the category was religion. When it named pre-flood kings with reign lengths of tens of thousands of years, the category was mythology. When it recorded a flood that interrupted civilization, the category was literary device. The scholars who built these categories were not inventing fiction. They were doing what scholars do, organizing unfamiliar evidence inside the frameworks they had. The problem is that the framework they had required a specific answer before the evidence was examined. It required the biblical timeline to hold. It required human civilization to be young. It required the developmental arc, primitive to complex, myth to reason, superstition to science, to begin where the framework said it began. The Sumerian King List arrived inside that framework and was sorted accordingly. The pre-flood section was mythological padding. The numbers were symbolic. The question of what the document actually encoded was closed before it could become inconvenient. What closed it was not argument, it was authority. The early Assyriologists were credentialed, institutional, and embedded in the publication networks that determined what legitimate scholarship looked like. Their interpretations became the consensus, not because they were tested against every available line of evidence, but because they were first, and because the institutions that produced them were powerful. The consensus calcified. Later, scholars inherited it, cited it, and reinforced it. Challenging it did not require disproving the evidence. It required confronting the institutional weight of a century of accumulated agreement. And here is where motive becomes visible in a way the field prefers not to examine. Two distinct interests converged on keeping the pre-flood section of the Sumerian King List classified as myth, and they converged not through coordination, but through structural alignment. The first interest was religious, a serious, evidence-based rereading of the pre-flood kings, one that took the cities, the flood layer, and the numerical structure as genuine data rather than literary invention, would push organized human civilization back by an order of magnitude. It would place sophisticated, record-keeping, astronomically observant human communities far outside the timeline Genesis accommodates. In the 19th century, when Assyriology was forming, that was not an academic problem. It was a civilizational one. The field was not going to produce that conclusion. The second interest was secular, but no less structural. The developmental model, the foundational assumption that human civilization moved progressively from primitive chaos toward organized complexity, is not a minor academic preference. It is the organizing logic of archaeology, anthropology, history, and the social sciences as they were constituted in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is what gives the professional fields their narrative shape. Evidence of sophisticated astronomical knowledge, organized political administration, and systematic record-keeping in deep prehistory does not refine that model. It breaks it. Not in the sense of a minor revision, but in the sense of requiring the entire framework to be rebuilt from different assumptions. Both interests, religious and secular, required the same outcome. The pre-flood kings had to remain symbolic. The numbers had to remain mythological. The document had to remain contained. And so they did. Not because the evidence demanded it, because the framework could not survive the alternative. The Sumerian King List is not the only ancient document that generates this problem. That is the detail that begins to change the scale. The Egyptian Turin King List, compiled during the reign of Ramesses II in the 13th century BCE, contains a section listing pre-dynastic rulers with reigns of comparable implausibility. Thousands of years assigned to figures the document treats as historical predecessors. The text is damaged and fragmentary, which has allowed the field to treat the pre-dynastic section as too incomplete to analyze seriously. But the structure is identical to what appears in the Sumerian document, a recognizably historical register applied to a period far beyond the accepted human timeline, recording named rulers with anomalous reign lengths, followed by a transition to the historical dynastic period the field considers real. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in approximately 300 BCE, composed a history of Mesopotamia in Greek for the Hellenistic world. He included a version of the Sumerian King List with pre-flood reign lengths even longer than those on the Weld-Blundell Prism. His original work does not survive. It comes down only in fragments preserved by later Greek historians who quoted him, which means the chain of transmission has provided the field with a reason to discount him as derivative and unreliable. But Berossus was a priest of Marduk with access to the Babylonian temple archives. He was not inventing a tradition, he was recording one. And his version extends the numerical structure even further than the clay prism in Oxford. The Mahabharata contains yuga cycle calculations that run into hundreds of thousands of years. The cosmological timescales embedded in the Hindu texts describe civilizational cycles, epochs of organized human existence separated by catastrophic collapses. That mirror in structure, though not in detail, what the Sumerian King List encodes. Independent civilizations with no documented contact are all producing, in their own registers, the same structural claim: that organized, knowledge-holding human communities existed before a catastrophic rupture, that the rupture was real and world-altering, and that what came after was a resumption, not a beginning. The mainstream response to this convergence has followed a consistent path. Coincidence? Shared psychological archetypes, the Jungian collective unconscious, common human responses to natural disaster. Each of these explanations keeps the convergence inside the category of symbol, where it can be studied as a curiosity without being taken as evidence. The pattern is noted. Then it is contained. The containing mechanism is always the same. Assign the overlap to the interior of the human mind, rather than to the exterior of human history. But the flood layer at Shuruppak is not a symbol. It is silt. Return now to the numbers, because the field's handling of them reveals something precise about how the containment works. Researchers examining the arithmetic of the pre-flood section have documented that several reign lengths correspond to multiples of the SAR, the sexagesimal unit of 3,600, which appears throughout Babylonian astronomical texts as a fundamental unit of celestial calculation, embedded in planetary period relations that Mesopotamian scholars tracked across generations. The number recurs in sky texts, in mathematical tablets, in the systematic observation records that Babylonian astronomers maintained for centuries. The arithmetic connecting the King List's pre-flood figures to these astronomical frameworks is documented, reproducible, and has been acknowledged in the scholarly literature. The field's response has been consistent. Acknowledge the arithmetic, classify the numbers as sacred or cultic, and move on. The logic applied runs roughly like this. The Sumerians and Babylonians were interested in astronomical cycles. Those cycles had religious significance, and numbers with religious significance were incorporated into texts as symbolic content. Therefore, the reign lengths are religious symbolism expressed numerically. The astronomical correspondence is real, but incidental. The numbers are not records. They are devotion. What this explanation never addresses is the format. The numbers appear inside a king list, a document type, with a specific, well-understood bureaucratic function. The king list genre was not a hymnal. It was not a temple text. It was an instrument of political authority. If the Sumerian scribes wanted to encode astronomical cycles in sacred texts, they had sacred texts to put them in. The question the field does not answer is why astronomical cycles, assigned religious significance, were embedded as fictional reign lengths inside the administrative document used to establish dynastic legitimacy. The explanation requires the scribes to have mixed genres in a way that would have been, within their own tradition, formally strange. The field acknowledges the oddity and then steps around it. Now add one more structure to the frame. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. This is not interpretation. It is archaeological fact. The site, dating to approximately 9,600 BCE, was filled in by its builders. The stone pillars covered, the enclosures packed with rubble, the entire complex interred under the hill that preserved it until its excavation in the 1990s. The builders did not abandon it. They did not flee it. They sealed it. The act of deliberate burial at a site of that scale, at that age, implies a decision, a choice to end something and preserve it under the earth. Whatever civilization organized the labor and knowledge required to build Göbekli Tepe ceased to function as a coherent social organization. Around the same period, its construction ended. The construction phase of the site corresponds to the end of the Younger Dryas, a rapid and catastrophic global climate shift that ended around 9,700 BCE and reshaped coastlines, altered rainfall patterns, and eliminated ecosystems across the planet within human lifetimes. The world that existed before the Younger Dryas boundary ended differently than it began. Something closed. Something was buried. And then, after an interval, something resumed. The flood layer at Shuruppak belongs to a later disruption, dated to the late 3rd millennium BCE, but it fits the same structural logic. The Sumerian King List treats the flood not as the beginning of civilization, but as an interruption of it. Kingship descended from heaven once before the flood. After the flood swept over, the kingship resumed. The document records a world that existed, was disrupted, and then continued. The Younger Dryas boundary fits that framework with an accuracy that makes the timing uncomfortable to ignore. What the pre-flood kings may represent is not fantasy and not mythology. They may represent the political organization, or the astronomical record, or the calendrical memory of communities that existed before the catastrophic climate shift ended the world they inhabited. Not before all of recorded time. not in a period of giants or divine beings. Before the Younger Dryas, before the coastlines moved, before the civilizational memory of a lost era was absorbed into the genre structures of whatever came next and labeled accordingly. That interpretation cannot be proven with what currently exists in the archive, but it does not need to be proven to raise the question the standard explanation refuses to answer. The cities are real. The flood layer is in the earth. The numbers follow internal structure. Multiple independent civilizations recorded the same framework. The field that controls interpretation was built to need a specific answer. And the classification of the pre-flood section as mythology has been repeated for over a century without being supported by anything more than the necessity of the conclusion. Put the case together plainly. The Sumerian King List is an administrative document. Its cities have been excavated. Its flood has been physically located in the archaeological record. Its numbers contain verifiable arithmetic patterns tied to astronomical observation. Parallel texts from independent traditions record the same structural event, and the interpretive framework applied to it was constructed within institutions that required those numbers to mean nothing. That is not coincidence. That is a field organized around a timeline. The Weld-Blundell Prism has been sitting in the Ashmolean since 1923. The pre-flood kings are still inscribed on it, in the same register, with the same reign lengths, in the same administrative voice that records every other transition the document contains. Eridu is still the first city. It is still one of the oldest confirmed urban sites on Earth. The flood layer at Shuruppak still separates two distinct periods of human habitation. The document still interrupts itself in the same flat, procedural notation. After the flood had swept over, the kingship resumed. The question was never whether those kings ruled for 28,000 years. The question was always what kind of civilization produced a document that remembered them, and what it means that we have spent a century deciding, very efficiently, that we should never seriously ask.